So, you want to win your Secrets of Power Planetary Qualifier, but you don't know what deck to do it with. This video is going to help you figure that out. This is going to be a preliminary tier list using the data from Beatle, using recent SWU stats published data that went up a week ago, and looking at set 5 data to get an idea of what the set 6 meta is going to be looking like going into the Planetary Qualifier season. Jump right into this with Anakin Data Vault. So this deck, according to its creator, Grumpy Elephant, my teammate, doesn't really have bad matchups. He says the only matchup he does not want to see is Piett Red. And aside from that, he thinks it's either all favored, maybe at worst 50-50. Shield decks like Gar ECL can be a little bit of a problem for it, but he thinks he's fine into it. If that's the case, this is the S tier deck. This is the tier 0 deck of the meta. This should be 40% of the meta. There's no reason not to play this deck. We want to give some weight to how the creator of the deck and the person that's most experienced on this deck views this deck. However, in my testing, I do see some ways to attack this deck. I think Space is a really good way to attack this deck. I think Odd Han in particular has a good to really good matchup against this deck. I think Talzin Yellow has a good to really good matchup against this deck. So there are ways to beat it. It does have very, very good matchups into a lot of the meta. It's beating Quinlan, it's beating Qi'ra, it's beating Han2, it's beating Han1. Like, it's going to be at least 50%, if not better, into a lot of these. It's going to be pushing 60-70% in a lot of these matchups. Got an insane value engine. The leader is providing value in terms of controlling the board. There's the cards like Nemec. It's just absolutely insane. It's also a way that's turning off like stuff like Tarkentown decks as a turn 1 play. Cobb Vanth just deploying another unit. It's going up into Kelleran deploying. It is just the go-to value mid-range deck. Control elements, aggro elements, has Cinta to just attack 25 health bases, only has to get them to 16, and then because of the 33 health on Data Vault, you get 25 plus damage on the base. Flipping with Anakin with the Cinta deploy, immediately ending the game if they have no Sentinel out. Like, this is a very powerful deck. I do not think it is the tier 0 deck. I do not think this is the S tier deck. I do not think this is the deck yet that is just automatically be played 40% of the meta, nothing else really to consider. But I do think this is going to be, if not the top of tier 1, then within the top 2 of tier 1. So it's going to start us off strong, top of tier 1, great deck to choose. Boba Data Vault. This deck was very popular in set 5. It never really performed well. It didn't really have any particularly good matchups. It didn't really convert many top 8s. When it did get to top 8, it really didn't win. It's not really a particularly good deck. In Beatle, we only saw a few being played. They did not do well. I mean, one got lucky enough to get me on Talzin Yellow, and Talzin Yellow, talk about more about that later, but not really doing much of anything. It is really a tier 4 deck. It is gonna struggle to convert those top 8s. It's gonna struggle even more to win a top 8. It is doing some powerful things. You know, the leader flip can be very strong. Ramping into big space units can be very strong, although there is another deck that does that better. But it's really just looking at the stats, looking at its past performance, looking at it compared to other top decks, it's really just not enough. So this is going to be the first tier 4 deck, something you're probably going to want to avoid. Gar ECL is going to start off our tier 3. I'm just going to drop it right there because it's going to be kind of an explanation of what tier 3 is going to be. These are going to be really the polarized decks of the meta. They're going to have some really good matchups, but then some really bad matchups. So these are going to be decks that are pushing like 70% in some matchups. So like Gar, for example, is going to be like 70% into Talzin decks. It's going to be like, 60 to 70% into Han2 decks. But then it's really going to struggle into a lot of other decks. It's going to get really bodied by aggro and struggle into Han1 Green. Anything that really, because of the nature of being a 6-flip leader and having kind of small, like even though they have shields, they're kind of like smaller bodies. Even with the +1, it's not really able to deal with it. The aggro lines only has those few really good matchups, and everything else is pretty bad. So it's like tier 3 is going to be the polarized tier, and Gar is is a great example of the types of decks we're going to see there as we're going down the tier list. Han1 Green, teammate Philip winning Beatle on this for the 2-peat at Beatle, first time in March in set 4. And again now in set 6. This is, I think without a doubt, one of the tier 1 decks. It's been a tier 1 deck for a while now. If you look at the SWU stats metrics, it's doing extremely well. It's a 70% deck. It's over a 70% deck if you look at the Data Vault version. However, there is the option to play Data Vault with this deck, so this is the green and Data Vault options. However, the strongest thing this deck can do is find resupply, and what Data Vault does is lower the odds of finding resupply. So that is somewhat concerning in terms of going the Data Vault route. You really want to be on the 30 health one to have that consistency, but what this deck does is very proactive. Being proactive is very good in a new meta, and in general. It has 2 very good strategies. The strategy of going resupply into flip, into Kellerin, develop a 3rd body, so you're getting the 4-6 leader out on turn 3, you're getting a 7-7 out on turn 3, you're getting like a 3-5 Obi-Wan or a 3-4 Falcon, immediately hitting for 3 on that turn, and then the Falcon doesn't even disrupt your next turn. Then if you get a crack in with Han again on the next turn, you're at 7 again and get to play another 7-drop. Very strong main line. It's got the best upgrade line. It's playing the best upgrade in the game, Chewbacca, being able to go into this space route and make this basically indestructible space unit that can't be interacted with well as a secondary line to attack decks that are weak to it. It is a very, very good proactive deck. It does have some troublesome matchups. It can struggle a little bit into like villainy decks that are going for more control-y routes, like Talzin Yellow, Temple Control variant, Qi'ra especially. Those decks, it's going to be a little weaker too, but it still has the ability to convert those, and then against everything else, it is very good. So similar to Anakin, this has an extremely good matchup spread, not too many bad matchups, and then this is doing something that's very proactive, which is good to be doing. It is arguably the top of tier 1. I think it is competing with Anakin for the top of tier 1. I think because we do know that this does have some definitive bad matchups, some not really terrible, but we know that they are unfavored, that it does safely slot in behind Anakin Data Vault, where Anakin Data Vault, it is a little still up in the air what those bad matchups will be, if any, although I do believe it has some. Cad Tarkintown. That's going to be our next tier 3 deck. This is another really polarized deck. It doesn't really matter which version you play. They are going to have different polarized matchups, but there are going to be some matchups that are very good for it, some matchups that are very bad for it. This is another deck that's very good at fighting Han2 Blue or Han2 decks in general, by nature of having Tarkintown, whereas Gar, it's by nature of having stuff like Kylo and being able to have those strong bodies that can hit into the low health units. So like Gar has that damage threshold with the shield that can kill the lowered health units of Han2, so that's why it's very good at attacking it. Cad with Tarkintown and the pings, very good at attacking those low health units and then getting the board control and transitioning into a mid-game push. However, it's going to be very polarized. It's going to have some very bad matchups into other top decks. It's not going to be the best pick to consistently get to that top 8, to consistently win that top 8. It's going into that tier where, yes, you can hit this matchup spread. That is very good for it, but you don't have a high chance of doing it. It is going to go above Gar. It does beat Gar in the head-to-head, and I think overall it is slightly better positioned than Gar, but it is filling a very similar role to Gar. Han1 Blue. So this deck has gotten various amounts of attention. I do think it is quite powerful when it hits the lines that it wants to hit. When it's getting that early force unit, this is Han1 Blue Force. When it's getting that early force unit and going into, rowing a villainy card, getting the Anakin on flip, being able to, on the same turn that it's flipping, minus the opposing flip by 6 if they've hit that villainy card on curve and been able to row it and then get rid of it with Anakin. The thing is, if it doesn't hit these optimal lines, it doesn't have the consistency of the top end. Like, Anakin's only a -3/-3. It's not going to be as good. It's still going to be good, but it's not going to be as good as a flip target. If it's not that, you have like stuff like Luke and stuff like the Han Solo unit, which when we look at the closest comparison, Han1 Green, Han1 Green has ramp, so it's doing it earlier. Han1 Green has better 7 drops coming from Green, Kelleran, U-Wing. This is a very good deck. I think this is a solid tiered 2 deck. It's going to be a good deck to get to top 8. It's going to be a reasonable deck for converting top 8. But the thing is, if you want to play this deck, there really isn't much reason to not play Han1 Green instead. They're doing very similar things, but Han1 Green is doing it better. Han2 Blue. This is a deck that people have been very focused on attacking for a while now. It was the strongest deck to be playing in set 5. Lost Force Throw still arguably was the top of set 5 meta. Primarily through Qi'ra, through the strength of the leader just being able to smooth out the curve. It's really hard to brick any hand with Han because you have just so many options, being able to reduce the cost. Just in a vacuum, one of the strongest leader abilities in the game. And then with Qi'ra just being able to produce a 4/4, draw 2 cards, that is so much card value while also converting some of it to the board in a 4/4 body. This is still going to be a solid tier 1 choice. Does have some ways to attack it, do have to be concerned about it being targeted, but similar to the other 2 decks in tier 1, has a very good matchup spread. Overall, going to be in the green in terms of matchups that it can hit, but does have a few red matchups. Maybe a bit more than Han1 Green and Anakin DV, but enough to warrant it being in tier 1. Sabine ECL, and Sabine Yellow for that part. So these 2 decks, tier 3 decks, they're going to be polarized for the most part. There's going to be decks that they're very good against and decks that they're very bad against. They are different, but similar in terms of their functionality. Both of them are implementing different forms of reach. The main difference being the 25 health ECL base, providing a way to interact for Sabine ECL, providing more dynamic reach with Wrecker being able to come down on the 6 resource turn if ECL has been saved, knock something to 1 health, overwhelm for 6, or kill a body with the ability ambush into another body to kill another unit and potentially leave a 7 power unit behind. I do think in the head-to-head, Sabine ECL is beating Sabine Yellow slightly, but Sabine Yellow does gain some points, getting the extra 5 points in a racing scenario, and having better access to space units and better access to capitalizing on decks that are weak to space. Sabine Yellow gaining Lightmaker from this set, very strong card. Sabine ECL gaining, both of them gaining Nemec, and then both of them also having access to Kazuda. So Nemec, just an extremely powerful card. Like we talked about with Anakin earlier, it is a great card for dealing with Tarkin Town decks as a turn 1, because it's like, okay, you killed it, but I still have an O2 body. It's pushing, like for Sabine in particular, that if you're on the play, you have that basically guaranteed 5 damage, probably going to be equaling more damage because there is that action economy where it's like, okay, they dealt with Nemec and now they're taking the O2, and now they have to deal with the O2 as well, so that O2 is probably going to lead to either itself getting another attack in or something else getting another attack in. So it is giving Sabine an incredible amount of reach, which is going to be pushing it even further in the matchups that it was already favored in, and helping it a bit in the matchups that it was unfavored in. For example, Talzin Yellow was a deck that was very, very good into this deck in set 5, and now with that extra bit of push from Nemec lines in particular, Talzin Yellow has really been struggling dealing with those. So Nemec, very strong card. The other card that I want to note from set 6 with this deck is Kazuda. The option to have a 2/6 body that attacks for 4, can attack for 6, especially if it's living till the Wrecker turn. So Wrecker is going to automatically put Sabine down in resources, which gives Kazuda an extra +2, making it hit for 6 instead of 4. Already being a 2/6 that hits for 4 is very strong. That is another card that's very good here. It's making good use out of Jar Jar. You know, have like these Jar Jar Yoda's lightsaber on 4 lines where you're able to flip Sabine, give it +2/+2 for the turn, then slam a saber on it, give it another +3/+1, pushing +5 damage on the flip turn. Deck's gotten even faster. The issue here is that it is a deck that is polarized. If the meta is skewed towards something that Sabine is going to be weak to, more on that a little bit later, then that could be a great pick, and that's going to be the same thing for pretty much all of the tier 3 decks. You have to know your meta. If you know your meta, one of these decks might be a great pick, but in a vacuum, they're not going to be the most consistent at converting. And then even less consistent at converting the top 8. Lastly, Sabine also has an issue of the more your opponent's skill goes up, the worse performing it is. Han2 ECL. So this has kind of been looked at by people, skilled people in the community, as the alternative to Sabine ECL at the moment. It is taking Sabine and being like, okay, we're going to just be a little more stable into the board. We're going to be doing a lot of more powerful, a lot more consistent things. You know, it's gaining Amidala on the turn, on the 3 resource turn, potentially producing a 5/1 body, producing 2 more O2 bodies that are then going to be able to push damage, be hard for your opponent to interact with, have other ways of generating spies, like the 3-drop 2/3 that it can play on turn 1 that also produces a spy token, has a Nemec to produce spy token, so it's very good at insulating Amidala from non-minus effect removal, from non-minus effect removal, so it has this very strong line that Amidala has turned on for the deck. It's still also doing a lot of very strong things that it was already doing in set 5, like the Bounty Hunter Quarry, which Anakin's also making great use out of. Being able to drop Gorilla Attack Pod as a 6-attack readied unit, being able to make a 4/5 in space on turn 2 if it wants to. Han2's ability just really shines in general, whatever you put it with. Green being the next best after Blue, and I would say that this is going to be solidly in tier 2. I want to say above Han1 Blue Force, and this is probably going to end up being the second best aggressive strategy with more mid-range elements, but aggressive strategy in the meta. Maybe third if we consider Han1 Green an aggressive strategy. So there's going to be another aggressive deck coming up in Odd Han Tarkentown. So Odd Han Tarkentown, this is the one I would put as the first primary aggro deck of the meta. This is going to be your go-to aggro deck if you are the aggro player. I think it's going to be the deck that puts pilots on the map as a very strong tier 1 option, very good consistency at getting to top 8s, very good consistency at converting top 8s. The reason for that is the plot cards. This makes such great use of the plot cards, such great use of Undercover Operation, I believe the card is, with Lightmaker, being able to go Lightmaker on 5 resources, deploy Han to it, ready it with Undercover Operation, having even other lines, like with Cinta, being able to delay the flip till 6 resources, and then having the ability to go deploy Sudden Ferocity, and then that's already 3 odd things that you've now put down. You only need 3 more to get this full 6 untap, you know, whatever you're on, that's 4. Get that full 6 untap, and now you're attacking with Cinta as well. You're getting the Cinta deploy, and that's an immediate +9 uninteractive damage on the 6. Like, that can just end the game by itself. The plot cards just make this so strong. Lightmaker makes this so, like, having those additional lines, like from Lightmaker, makes it so strong. And then Tarkentown. Tarkentown is a big part of this deck. One of the ways that Space Aggro really gets held down is through Fast Falcon. It's through Fast Falcon and, to an extent, Starfighter from an Anakin deck. And what Tarkentown does is say, well, you're going to be able to kill one of my 1-drops with it, but then I'm going to Tarkentown in it. And that's it. It's, you know, if they're throwing a card like from a Han deck, if they're waiting till turn 2 to Falcon, and then taking out a turn 1 unit with it, potentially like a 1-drop, and then they're getting that feels pretty bad. And then an extension of that is the ability to add rather consistently extra health to units. So, like, okay, what's another way that we can attack pilot decks? Being able to play Bombing Run on 5, something Han2 Blue has utilized a lot when Vader Yellow has been popular in the meta. Odd Han, being able to play cards like the Han Pilot, being able to play cards like Boshek, is able to push those X2s, those X3s, out of range of Bombing Run pretty consistently, which takes away yet another avenue to attack these go-wide space aggro decks. It's also able to really mess with interaction from decks like Anakin that have a threshold, that have, like, let's say that 4 damage threshold. like Eager Escort, or that 3 damage threshold, like Blue Leader, being able to be like, okay, I am gonna, on my second turn, play Boshek on my X2 and make it into an X4, get it out of range of Blue Leader, play it on my X3, make it into an X5, get it out of range of Eager Escort and Open Fire. This is also really disrupting Bounty Hunter Quarry lines. Like, this has the potential to just really beat any deck in the meta currently, in my opinion. It's not going to be entirely the most consistent. It's probably going to be its biggest issue, but it has a lot of very good matchups. There aren't very many bad ones, and it is solving a lot of the issues with the linear play pattern of space decks, especially with another aspect of this, being able to deploy upgrades on multiple units on the flip turn. So it's not just like, oh, they're making one really big pilot unit that can, something like Bamboozle can now deal with, you know, if everything's on one unit, Bamboozle's dealing with all of that. But like, let's say they put a Son of Ferocity on one unit, Son of Ferocity on another unit, and then Han on a third unit. They're now getting +9, but spread out over 3 units. This has, it's a probably going to be the hardest space aggro deck to play. Well, is the hardest deck to space aggro deck to play to date, but it's also going to be the most powerful. So that nuance comes with an increase in power level, and I think it's definitely something to look at if you are an aggro player, especially if you're a space aggro player. This is going to be the go-to deck for this set so far, in my opinion. Looking at Iden Data Vault. So this has been yet another really polarizing deck. I think it is going to be the best deck at winning slower, grindier matchups. It's going to struggle sometimes into some value, but it does have the tools to just get through it and just survive through it with the healing. So, for example, where Qi'ra might lose to Han2 Blue through something like Crate Dragon at the top end because they don't have enough health left, Iden, with that healing turn after turn after turn, is going to be staying out of range of reach, so it's going to be gaining points into those grindy mid-range games. It still can struggle a little bit with the card advantage. Qi'ra can kind of just make the pull ahead in card advantage, stuff like putting multiple bodies on the board, like Kellerin, like Ewing, but this does have access to 3 super lasers, unlike Qi'ra, so it does have the ability to actually fight that value and try to get to fatigue. The issue is it's very polarized. Even with that healing, because it's a 6 deploy leader, it will just sometimes fold to these aggressive strategies, to aggro decks, to decks like Adhan, to decks like Sabine, to decks like Quinlan, to decks like Han2 ECL. Even Han1 Green is going to have an easier time here because they're going to have less time to interact. Iden deploying later, that's a later overwhelming barrage as well that can be utilized with the leader. It's just not going to be as good at dealing with those aggressive strategies, but is going to be probably the best deck to deal with slower, grindier strategies and really just fatigue them out. Talking about Kylo Tarkintown and Kylo Data Vault. So, in the last set, Kylo Data Vault came out somewhat popular in the beginning, never really had many good performances. The nature of being a 7-flip leader, even doing something as strong as potentially just winning the game on deploy, isn't really enough. It's also it's in the colors that is doing something like Timely Vader, but again, that's very slow. This is something that's just a bit too slow to exist in set 5. It really hasn't gained much from set 6. We didn't really see it perform in set 5. Like, it had its moments here and there, but it just really wasn't able to convert. We saw Kylo Tarkintown perform very well at Worlds, but then kind of, stabilize after that, fall off a lot after that, and ended up having a lot of really polarized matchups. Not just polarized matchups, it just wasn't even performing that well in its good matchups. Although it did have some, it's also a very hard deck to play, so there is some like pilot proficiency here that can say like, okay, you're really good on this deck, it might be higher. But since losing Force Throw, the Tarkintown version just isn't really doing anything anymore. And then even before, when it had Force Throw, it was really just winning off of the skill of the pilot more than the deck. This deck has never really been all that impressive, and especially now in set 6, I think both of these are solid tier 4s, if not F tiers, but I think they can be placed in tier 4 with Boba Data Vault and with the other decks that will end up being here. Speaking of, Piett. Piett I like to describe as Han at home. It is doing very similar thing to Han1 Green, ramping into a deploy that's giving you +2 resources. The issue there being there aren't many good 7s. There aren't really any good 7s. Kind of looking for 8s. So you kind of need a ramp and then get to an 8. There is now the ability to do that a little more consistency with the new droid, the new gunk droid, that if you get it on turn 1 and it's sticking that, you know, turn 1 gunk, turn 2 ramp, turn 3 deploy with the gunk, you now have your 8. You now get there and drop your big space unit that is also going to interact with the ground arena and clean up some units and help you in that race, or just help you push more damage to base. It's going to have very high attacks, which is going to be able to turn cards sideways and kill your opponent very fast. And with 9 ramp essentially now, with the droid, but the droid not putting a resource in doesn't accelerate you to the deploy, so you kind of, it's just that's kind of supplementing your other ramp. It is doing it consistently, but the issue is the leader only has 2 power. The 7 health does matter. It will be relevant in terms of helping him stick around for an extra round, but the 2 power isn't helping it push damage. The bodies that it's putting out are only singular bodies, where compared to Han1 Green, it's putting out multiple bodies with U-Wing, with Kelleran. Kelleran's really breaking the game, being able to put 10 resources out, you know, especially if you value the 7/7. Most of the big things in the game, you know, you're paying 7 resources for 7/7. They have an upside as well, but the upside of it's just so strong. What Han1 is doing is just so strong, and what Piett's doing, it's good. It's going to be good enough to convert sometimes, maybe convert a top 8, but we look at the stats for the deck in set 5, it was in the red for the most part. It's also just losing to almost all the top tier decks, like Han1 Green it's losing to. It does have some play into something like Anakin, like Han1 Green it's going to struggle with, Han2 Blue it can struggle with, Odd Han it can struggle with, Han2 Quinlan, like the faster decks like Quinlan and Han2 ECL it can struggle with. So like, even though it has this one potentially really good matchup in Anakin, and if Anakin's like that 40% of the meta, and we know Piett's the deck that is the hardest for Anakin to beat, then it might have that space where like, okay, now we can choose this deck, but it's taking tier 3 and going even a step further. It's just pretty much a losing deck that has just this one really good matchup, and that's it. So like, it did gain the droid, helping it with a little consistency, gained Fulminator, helping it a bit with consistency, but overall, the strategy the deck is implementing is just not able to convert against a lot of the played decks in the meta, is something that should probably be avoided. It is going to go at the top of tier 4. I do think this is the big space strategy, because Boba Dadawal's also kind of trying to do something a little similar. Of that strategy, I think Piett is going to be more consistent at doing it. Looking at Palp Yellow, so this is going to be another very polarized deck. I'm going to put it behind Iden. I think there is argument to put it above Iden. They have very similar matchup spreads, but then Iden is beating Palp normally in the head-to-head because it's not really playing units. It's just trying to fatigue, and you know, if Palp does flip and get anything, it has the 3 super laser blasts. It doesn't really care about that game. The way Iden is beat is by going against an aggro deck that's just killing Iden before it can really get to that late game power and get to that vigilance mill out. So Palp is doing something very similar to Iden, but there is very little reason to choose it over Iden. Very similar matchup spread, very polarized matchup spread. Iden does it better. Qi'ra. This is something that's common throughout tier 2. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier. The tier 2 is like really the 50-50 decks. This deck could arguably be in tier 1. I think it's in tier 2 just because it's going to struggle into Anakin. It has now tools to deal with space aggro a bit better. It's going to be decent at dealing with Odd Han without Force Throw giving the further card advantage line to Han2 Blue. It is now able to pretty much fight on even footing with Han2 Blue, so now it went from a losing matchup with Han2 Blue to about a 50-50. It is favored into Han1 Green, but for the most part, this is around a 50-50 deck. It's going to be very good in terms of consistency over a lot of rounds of play, over multiple PQs. It's going to be very good at consistently getting to top 8. It's not going to be the best at winning top 8s because it's not really targeting, like, unless you're just sitting there like, oh, I'm going to hit Han1 Green like 4 times or 3 times in the top 8. It's not really hitting matchups that it's going to be very favored into. And then it also does have the class of decks, the Palp class of decks, Palp, Iden, Yoda, eventually we'll be talking about, that it does kind of just fold to. So there are ways to attack it that are going to be in the meta, which then push it, you know, from a deck that is going to be 50-50 for the most part into the decks that it wants to see, some slightly favored, into then also having some really bad matchups. So I do think, because the bad matchups should be not represented much in the meta, and then everything else, it is pretty much 50-50 into, if not a little favored into some other, like Han1 Green, it is pretty solidly top of tier 2, good at converting top 8s, reasonable at winning top 8s, but not going to be the best. Now we're going to look at both Yodas. Yet again, another polarized deck. This is going to be in the same vein as Palpatine, the same vein as Iden. If this is a deck type that you like to play, honestly, just play Palpatine or Iden. Iden is a little bit different because Iden's kind of the fatigue style. I'm just going to play all events. But in terms of a leader that deploys late in the game and then interacts with the board in a very powerful way, Palpatine does it better. You do deploy one turn later on Palpatine, but the benefit is you're gaining a leader ability that actually interacts with the game. Whereas Yoda, it's just filtering. All you're doing with Yoda is filtering cards, where Palpatine is getting a ping, extra value from weak units, and drawing a card to hand, and then it's also taking a unit on flip. It's pretty much very similar matchup spreads, but Palpatine is going to be better, and then Palpatine is also going to beat Yoda in the head-to-head. Yoda is doing some powerful things, especially in the red version where you have access to Rey. Hitting the high roll Rey with Yoda is very, very powerful. Having it in the starting hand, it also makes all of these like mediocre cards in Yoda, like C-3PO, although that does just draw whenever Yoda's online. It does make them even better. It's turning the new -2/-2 that draws a card into a -2/-2 and another 2 damage, so like a 4 damage event pretty much, with the addition of Rey, the new -2/-2 draw a card. It is doing some very powerful things, but some of the tools it's playing aren't that strong in the early game. It can just outright lose the early game, and then it also has the issue of if it's lost the early game completely and the opponent's gotten +2, +3 units going into the flip turn and kept Yoda's board clear, if not just had the ability to just like ignore Yoda at that point and go face and kill him, especially on a 25 health base, then Yoda's in a position where, oh, I have no units, my opponent has 3 units, I'm gonna have to spend an event to kill my opponent's unit, and my flip, and then go through the action process of putting something on top of my deck, to then kill something, and then all I'm left with is my leader, which, yes, it has restore, yes, we've killed 2 units, but if the opponent's still left with a unit out, especially if it's like a leader unit, a leader that's suited up, so like, let's say Anakin with the saber, let's say Talzin with the saber, which now Yoda can't kill, it's getting the restore to, but that unit's probably just going to be like claim and then die on the first action. Data Vault's a little insulated to that with that extra 8 life, but then it's losing Rey. It's losing the high roll line that Red has access to. I do think in the head-to-head, Data Vault is a little bit better positioned than Tarkin Town. I don't really think Force decks should be considered with these. I'm not going to go too much into that now for the sake of time, but ultimately, if Yoda is the type of deck you're considering playing, you might just want to go with Palpatine Yellow anyways. It's going to be very similar matchup spread. Palpatine Yellow is going to do it better. I would also like to add some commentary here about when it is right to choose the Tier 3 deck. I want to look at the Hex PQ from Set 5. Hex PQ from Set 5 was very control-heavy meta. People that knew that meta going into it were like, man, this is so control heavy, I'm just going to be trying to play the most value deck as possible. We had Didier on Yoda Red making top 8. We had Pasquale on Yoda Red making top 8. We had a Palpatine Yellow making top 8. We had an Iden, I think, barely missed top 8. It was just this very slow, control, grindy meta. Not many aggro decks present as well, so that would have been another way to attack it. That might have been a good meta to maybe choose something like Sabine ECL. Although, again, Sabine ECL issues with the higher you get in skill level, the better people are at dealing with it or surviving it. So what we ended up seeing there is the Palpatine Yellow winning the Hex PQ. There was 2 Yoda Reds in the top 8, ended up being a Yoda Red versus Pasquale versus the Palpatine Yellow in the final, and Palpatine Yellow is just doing what Yoda does, but better, and it was not that close of a match. Similar matchup spread, but Palpatine does it better, and Palpatine ended up winning the Hex PQ, and that is where choosing that tier 3 deck is going to be good. You know that it's going to be skewed towards an entirety of a matchup spread that is favored for these decks, and then you want to choose that tier 3 deck. I also think Iden was a very good choice in that matchup, but then the issue with Iden is also time and clock and drawing. That player ended up drawing against me and I think another player. Quinlan Tarkintown. I think this is, based on how it functions, solidly at the bottom of tier 2 in the way that I've defined the tier. So tier 2 is kind of the 50-50 tier at the moment. And Quinlan does really fall into that currently. I do think there are aggressive strategies that are better than it. I also think it has a lot of holes. I think losing Force Throw really hurt the deck. And I would say, like, it's towards the side of being a little towards a losing deck, but it is at least 50-50 into most matchups. Like, maybe more towards 45. I think it's pretty solidly at the bottom of tier 2. If you're really good at this deck, if you're really practiced on this deck, it can be winning a lot of the matchups into a lot of the other really good decks. It's going to be beating the slower decks, like a lot of the tier 3s, like Iden through Yoda. It does have the ability to just go under those and beat those. It has access to Qi'ra as well to really disrupt those slower strategies. It is still a good deck. I wouldn't say great deck. It is still a good deck. If you're very practiced on it, it is a reasonable choice. You can convert top 8s. I don't think it's going to be that easy to win top 8s. I think with pretty much every other deck in tier 2, the other decks are going to be better at converting top 8s and arguably better at getting to top 8s. But I do think this will slot in at the bottom of tier 2. Still a very reasonable choice. And if you like that color combination, if you like Tarkintown and you don't want to play a fully space strategy, you just really like Quinlan, this is still a fine deck to choose. Rey Data Vault. This is kind of polarized. It's kind of hard to say where it falls in the polarized section, but because it's kind of going to struggle into a lot of the other slower decks. It does have tools to just keep grinding, keep producing bodies. It does have tools to beat the slower decks. It has tools to beat some of the faster decks as well, but the thing is, it's kind of just losing into everything. Like, slightly at least. Like, Han1 Green is just going to go faster than it and kill it. Space decks are just absolutely abysmal for it. Han2 Blue can just, like, produce these really big bodies, which Rey can deal with reasonably. Rey is playing Restore units, is playing potentially high health units that with the +1 can go over the early game reduction in health and high power of Han2. But overall, it is kind of just a losing deck. I think there's even an argument to put it at the top of tier 4. But given its matchup spread, if you look at on SWU base and like look at how it's performed in set 5, I think there's an argument for putting it in tier 3 into the polarized deck. I do think it could easily be tier 4 though. I'm going to end up putting it behind the Yodas. I think there's an argument also for putting it in front of the Iden, in front of this block. It's a little bit hard deck to assess, but I do think given what tier 1 and tier 2 look like, you probably want to avoid this deck. Really, the only deck it's going to want to see out of tier 1 and tier 2 is Qi'ra, and even at that, I don't even think the Qi'ra matchup is that bad. Anakin's just going to run over Rey as well, and Anakin might end up being the most played deck going into set 6, so we're going to put it towards the bottom of tier 3 at the moment, maybe even below Cad. I think let's slide it in below Cad, even though it's very similar with this other grouping. Sabe Yellow. New deck into the set 6 format, set 6 leader. I don't really say any type of breakout deck. There was a player at Beattle that did fairly well with it, Tony from Late Night Gaming. He did perform fairly well with it. And I do think the color combination is quite good. We do have a new tool, the new 2-drop card that produces 2 O2 spies on turn 1, disclosing a a bunch of aspect symbols from the hand and then also replacing itself, which is quite powerful. Padme Tarkintown's another deck that's kind of trying to utilize that. But the issue is, it's really just not doing enough to get there against most of the tier 1, tier 2 decks. It's not really fitting into tier 3, where it's like very polarized. There are decks that it's going to be very good against and decks that are very bad against. It's kind of just a losing deck, which is where a lot of the tier 4 decks are, where these are they have the potential. They definitely have the potential of getting there, but it probably won't, and then even if it does, it's probably not converting. And then there's also the argument that if you're in these color combinations, Han1 Yellow is probably just going to be doing it better. Having that resource cheating, having that earlier deploy leader, having the ability to go into something like Enfys or Han Unit early, like, it's just stronger. There's really very little reason to be playing Sabe over Han1 in this combination. And then even if you were playing Han1, maybe it moves up to polarized tier. Maybe then there's some matchups that it's going to be very strong against, but there's going to be plenty of matchups that it's going to be very weak against. So at most, this might bump up to tier 3. Talzin Red. This was the deck that won Galactics in set 5. I do think a lot of that had to do with people being unprepared for the type of build that was utilized. It didn't really perform that well after that. Definitely has really struggled since the Force Throw ban. I think overall, even with Force Throw, this was really just a slightly losing deck into the field. It can kind of beat anything, but doesn't really... It kind of doesn't really beat anything. It can. It's kind of just like 45% or worse into a lot of these decks. It's probably somewhere towards the top of tier 4, especially without Force Throw now. There's the argument that a lot of people have made that this is a very hard deck to pilot optimally, which I do think with my experience with Talzin Yellow and how hard Talzin Yellow is to pilot, that may be true. But if we look at the data for the deck, if we look at its performance since Worlds, even in top cuts, it's just not really doing anything. It can do really powerful things like Krennic, being able to play multiple bodies on turn 2, being able to discount things and play things earlier on the curve. Force Lightning's very strong. The flip is very strong. The ability is very strong. Like, just like Piett, it is doing some, just like Boba, it is just like Kylo. These are all decks that are doing potentially very strong things. They're just not strong enough given what the rest of the meta looks like. And it is overall just going to be a slightly losing deck. I think we can probably put it above Piett. Probably going to be at the top of tier 4. But it is really not a deck that should really be seeing play right now. Talzin Yellow. My pet deck that I just got second with in 3v3 at Beattle. I did end up not doing well in the pools, and that's because it has pretty bad space matchup that I'm trying still to figure out with my team. However, it is very good at beating a lot of the tier 1 decks. It's got a favorable matchup into Anakin DV. It's got a favorable matchup into Han1 Green. It's got a favorable matchup into Han2 Blue. It's at worst 50-50 into Qi'ra. It's at worst 50-50 into Han2 ECL. Han1 Blue with the high roll line, that's going to be hard for it. So like Han1 Blue, Odd Han Tarkintown because we're weak to space, that's going to be very hard for it. Quinlan, I don't know if it's good into Quinlan yet, because I thought it was good into Quinlan in set 5, and then I practiced versus Cluis, and I was like, wait, this is terrible. But a big part of that was being hit with Force Throw on flip turn, discarding the Han, and then Talzin dying. It still has the issue of Plo Koon being an auto kill, but that one's a little more navigable because Talzin is very good at fighting Quinlan for the board, especially when getting shielded lines that interact positively with Tarkintown. It can struggle with Quinlan's ability, especially now with Nemec, to just like push a lot of damage really fast and then close with the Fast Falcon in space. So Quinlan's still up in the air whether it's good or bad, but of the rest of the decks, it's good into, it's 50-50 or better into everything here, except for Odd Han and Han1 Blue. The thing that would potentially put it down into tier 3, which I would put it at the top of tier 3, is that it is somewhat polarized against space decks. But I think maybe we figured out Piett Red, maybe we figured out Boba Data Vaults. There's also the argument that in terms of that polarization, it's not like slow deck versus aggro deck, it's space versus ground, and Piett Red and Boba4 DV arguably shouldn't be in the meta, but we really don't know what's going to happen. Set 5, people chose to play Boba4 DV anyways, even though it was arguably a very terrible deck. So, might be my bias showing a little bit. I do want to say this is going to be at least the top of Tier 2. I do think it could arguably be anywhere in Tier 1, if not the top of Tier 1. But that's clearly my bias showing. Let's see some results first. I'm going to put it at the top of Tier 2 for now, because of its ability to positively interact with pretty much all of the other top tier decks, and maybe have figured out the space matchup. So then, at worst, being like a 50-50 into most of the other decks, maybe slightly unfavored into something like Odd Han, and then Han1 Blue with the high roll line being very hard for it. Padme Tarkentown. Actually, just, we're just going to slam the rest of these. So these were kind of just added here because they're decks you kind of can see, but these are the F tier decks. I put them at the end for the reason, just to kind of talk about them all together. Talk about Padme Tarkentown first. 6 flip leader, 6 health leader. These are big downsides compared to something like Quinlan, which is doing a very similar thing. Quinlan having 7 health matters a lot. Quinlan being able to deploy on 5 resources matters a lot. Padme, the 6 flip is just too late. I don't really see what this deck is bringing to the table and where it's going to be getting those points into matchups to get those top 8 conversions, let alone win top 8. I do think it's going pretty solidly in the F tier, where it's not able, it's really just not able to convert to those top 8s, and then not going to be able to win them anyways. Maybe if somebody has a really good run, it can get that top 8 conversion, but like, how is it going to win? It's just losing into a lot of the top tier decks. Pretty solidly in F tier. I'm including it because it had some reasonable representation in Seattle, but ultimately I think there's very little reason to choose this over Quinlan, and then even if you were to choose this over Quinlan, I just don't think its matchup spread is that good. And then we have the 4 other pilot decks. So we have Odd Han, I think very clearly a tier 1 deck, and then Boba4 DV very clearly a tier 4 deck. These decks are just not gonna, they're just not gonna cut it. Kazuda Yellow, I think, is the one that, or Kazuda in general, I'm including Yellow because that's what George the Hulk played at Seattle to success in the 3v3. I think he did reasonable in the pools. There's also the blue version that's played a reasonable amount, and the red version that's played a reasonable amount. The issue with just all the pilots in general is they're very linear and very easy to interact with and disrupt. And aside from Odd Han, with just the craziness it can do on the flip turn, pretty much all of the pilot leaders are just telegraphing what they're doing too much, and there are too many tools to deal with them. Maybe in a meta that's very unprepared for them, they have the opportunity to convert to that top 8, but it's going to be very hard for them to win the top 8. They don't really have many favorable matchups. They have quite a few really bad matchups. And ultimately, with Odd Han now having the tools that it has, if this is a strategy you want to use, like towards the aggro side of things, or even like towards the more mid-range, kind of mid-rangey side of things with Luke, Luke probably maybe more comparable with Boba in terms of how it plays, but if you are going to go with a pilot strategy, there's very little reason not to go with Odd Han instead. So the pilots just really don't make the cut. So this is the final tier list. Again, tier 1 being the decks that are just a lot of very good matchups, not many very bad matchups. These are going to be the decks that you can like just jam into multiple PQs and probably top 8. If you pilot them well, you're going to be able to top 8 pretty consistently. Tier 2 are kind of the 50-50 decks, with Talzin Yellow kind of being the exception, where it really should be in tier 1 or tier 3, but kind of my bias is just like keeping it here, where it's not really a 50-50 deck. It's a deck that's really attacking the top 2 tiers of the meta, but tier 2 being the 50-50 decks for the most part. Tier 3 being the polarized decks. These are decks that tend to be either very good against aggro or very good against slower decks, but they're really, if they hit the wrong end of that spectrum, they're gonna struggle a lot. Sabine's gonna be struggling into those faster decks quite a bit, and then Cad and Gar are kind of like their own unique thing. kind of like being really good against Han2 Blue, but then struggling into a lot of other really good against both of them. Are Cad's kind of bad against Talzin, but Gar is really good against Talzin. Kind of having just a select few matchups they're really good against. Maybe that's an argument to even put them in tier 4, but polarized tier. And then we have the decks like Yoda through Iden, very good into the slower decks. Issue with these, including Rey, you're gonna struggle with time. Even if you're hitting the brackets that you want, the matchups that you want to hit, there's a good chance you're going to be going to time. So that's also a reason to avoid these decks. Tier 4, probably just don't touch these decks. Maybe you convert, but like you're pretty much losing into everything. There's very little reason to play these, and then F is just an extension of that where you're almost never going to convert. If you enjoyed this, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If there's anything you are interested in seeing, any decks that you think I left out from this tier that should have been included, video ideas that you'd like a deck you would like a deeper dive into, please leave a comment. I am open to receiving ideas from the community and working on making that content. If you did enjoy this, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Very good for the algorithm. And thank you for watching. May the cards be with you.